Imagine the psychological and physical torture these strong soldiers and so-called prisoners of war had to go through that converted them into the living dead. The Korean War intrigued extreme hopelessness in these mighty soldiers. Let's have a brief idea about what it was like to be a prisoner during the Korean War. It would be easier to read or see what they might have been through, but they only are the ones that know the pain and have lived every single day of their life. The worst decision of life. Upon their return, a study conducted on thousands of American POWs, prisoners of war, suggests that most soldiers regret joining the peacetime army during the Korean War. The higher authorities were overconfident about easily winning the war against the Koreans. They also underestimated the Korean military capabilities, resulting in a one-sided battle. All of these new and young recruits were promised to return home soon. Unfortunately, it turned out to be their worst nightmare. With insufficient ammunition, most of these young-blooded soldiers died, and many were taken as prisoners of war, even worse than a nightmare. The brutal capture. These captured prisoners of war were as young as 17. The time these young minds served in captivity were going to be a horrifying nightmare. Communist soldiers rounded up their fresh detainees and herded them like animals. The injured soldiers were taken away and shot to instill fear in the minds of captured prisoners of war. These animal shelters, like enclosures, offered no protection from the bitter cold. These communist Koreans didn't end there. They were ordered to take off the thick military suits, leaving them with nothing more than a thin jacket, a scarf, and a hat. Some soldiers luckily had leather boots that prevented frostbite on their toes, but it was just for some time. Many soldiers lost toes due to sweat freezing around them, since these rubber boots didn't absorb moisture like the leather ones. Winds gusted from 50 to 60 miles per hour. To keep their bodies warm in those cramped quarters, they had to keep moving, or else they had to wait to die. Severely injured soldiers who couldn't move succumbed to death. Death March. On gruesome execution marches, the captors marched their captives. They endured agonizingly lengthy walks every evening and into the night while carrying very little food and drink. From the side of the road, residents hurled rocks at them. A prisoner was shot, clubbed, or stabbed to death if he passed out or could not continue. Every day, men perished from malnutrition and dehydration. Before the Chinese created more proper prison camps to keep captives, these marches lasted for around 7 months. Brain conditioning. The Chinese separated the officers and leaders from the other prisoners of war camps. They understood that if the commanders could not communicate with the people under their control, there would be less likelihood of a POW uprising. Every day, the communist station Radio Beijing would crackle over speakers in English, accusing the U.S. of instigating the war and causing such agony. Journalists sympathetic to the communists visited the camps regularly to talk to prisoners. They propagated to these prisoners how communism was the answer to the brighter and more equitable future. During work hours, the prisoners needed to attend classes projecting the United States as a hostile imperialist country rather than a democracy. Prisoners who appeared to be rebelling or opposing such teachings were taken away and subjected to horrendous beatings, isolation, and even starving to death. One of the heinous punishments for those resisting their communist beliefs was putting them into a sweatbox for months. This sweatbox was a small box about 3.5 feet high, 5 feet tall, and 2 feet wide. Psychological tortures. Later, the security of these war camps decreased and these POW camps lacked security. Yet, no one attempted to flee. Very few of them were willing when they were released to turn home. Those freed had a pronounced lack of companionship. Few appeared to have formed pals. After returning, it was common for a soldier to stroll into his hut and lie down in a lonely spot, drawing a blanket over his head. Many of these war prisoners died a few days after their return. Imagine the level of distress they might have been through, which eradicated hope from the minds of these tough soldiers. A study of 1,000 prisoners of war after the war revealed that they exhibited a state of profound and widespread pessimism. It was found that they used 4 psychological techniques to push these soldiers to such an extent of hopelessness. First was divide and rule. When inmates turned against one another, the North Koreans would reward them with smokes or candies. Amazingly, neither the perpetrator nor the reporting soldier received a penalty. The true goal was to break the bond and confidence amongst the prisoners of war. Second, brutal self-criticism was encouraged. Soldiers were forced to confess the evil and the positive things they had done while in captivity in small groups that the captors had created. This confessing was done to undermine the sense of dignity and self-respect rather than for the benefit of the North Koreans. The third strategy was breaking allegiance to the fellow soldiers and the country's leadership. It was meant to undermine a culture of collaboration and teamwork and replace it with selfishness and extreme self-interest. These troops, once fought for each other, were morally destroyed to an extreme extent. After spending a few years at these POW camps, they were morally tarnished. They watched their ill comrades being dumped outside the hut into the cold and left to die. When asked why they didn't do anything about it, they said it wasn't their responsibility. The most heinous plot was depriving these prisoners of war of all the good news back home. All positive information coming was withheld while these soldiers were flooded with negative news received in letters from their homes. When these soldiers received consoling and encouraging letters from home, they were not given to them and held by the captors. On the other hand, any negative news like the death of family members and relatives was handed away. This constant demoralization resulted in profound dissatisfaction with loved ones, their nation, and their faith. These psychological tortures deprived them of 3 fundamentals of humanity: faith, hope, and love. A firm faith in an all-powerful God who comes to aid in difficult circumstances was destroyed. Hope was gone, defined as an unwavering mental conviction that the best is still to come regardless of current circumstances. Broke their commitment to the well-being of others around them, including their family. These prisoners of war were malnourished and without access to medical facilities. There was no way out if they were ill, since North Korea had no medicine for captured Allied soldiers. The winter season just added to the anguish. The death toll was on the rise. Imagine a dying person next to you and being powerless to intervene. The captors would arrange for a funeral and discard these deceased detainees once a week. These terrible individuals were not properly buried since digging holes in the severe weather proved difficult. The Korean army would discover combat-dug holes and throw all of the deceased men into one pit. Being a prisoner of war means dying every day, unaware of your fate and what will happen next. A small mistake could turn into your last breath. All of these prisoners of war were also subjected to atrocities. Of 7,000 U.S. detainees, 2,800, or almost 40%, perished in captivity due to hunger and inadequate medical care. Only 1,200 of the surviving soldiers were able to return home. Most of them perished within the first year after returning, and only a few hundred could resume a normal life. Thanks for watching the video. If you liked the video, check out other historical videos on our channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you don't miss out on such interesting topics.